This is our second formally virtual event. We had one in March, but we had to scramble to get that one out of the way. Now we're a little bit more organized, and we're aiming to have this events on the first Thursday of every month. Make it virtually during lunchtime. So I hope this helps most folks. In terms of today, we'll do a few announcements and talk about job openings. We'll move on to our main presenter today, Michael, and we'll see about next month. I'll also leave the meeting a little bit open for a while for networking, just chat. Sadly, you need to bring your own pizza now and your own beer. Microsoft is sponsoring the Microsoft Community Tenant, which is where this thing is running, and To The Lead is sponsoring my time to organize and keep things during work time. So thank you both. In terms of announcements, I see a few names that I'm not too familiar. I see Dino. Dino, thank you for joining us. I think you're from Vancouver. Have you joined our meetups in person in the past?
I have attended one meetup.
Oh, great.
Before I saw that there was, because the talk was about Microsoft Teams, which is something that my company is currently using, I wanted to really learn and listen in.
Perfect. I think you're in the right place for that with some guidance from Michael on governance. It'll be great. And Eric, hello.
Hi guys, yeah, Eric Holson here from PC Hydro. I attended events, bug meetings, probably years and years ago, but not recently. Also interested in the topic of Microsoft Teams. I've worked with Michael in the past, so interested in hearing what he's up to these days. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to the presentation.
Perfect. Great to have you, Eric. Thank you all. And in terms of events, well, we had just Ignite last week now, and there's great announcements. Of course, that event already passed, but the good thing about the virtual events is all the videos are there and the highlights, and there was just a plethora of information that we're probably all still absorbing there. Other nice opportunities. Saturday, Saskatchewan, it's October 3rd. Ottawa is on the 17th, and then Cincinnati on the 23rd, which are the upcoming events that you can watch right from where you are. So great. In terms of job openings, I have a few. One from Collabware still open. I haven't spoken to Tom. I want to make sure it's still there, so that's why I keep it there. To the lead, we just hired a round of project managers, and now we're still looking for Office or Microsoft 365 consultants, as well as just modern SharePoint devs. In terms of, I was also reached out by a company called Ignite Technical Resources, and they're looking for a Microsoft Office 365 solution specialist. That's a 3-month contract, which is going to be based in Burnaby. And if you like alcohol, hint, you'll probably like this job. Orchestry, I just put it there. I'm not sure if you're hiring. Wanted to just give you an opportunity to say if there's anything there. Happy to get you to share.
Yeah, we've got about 10 positions open, so we've got a lot. Yeah, we got quite a few. So everything from technical devs to QA to a partner manager, and a few others. So yeah, we've got a lot. So yeah, if anyone's interested, just feel free to get in touch with me.
Perfect. I'll keep that in mind as well if we hear anyone looking for an opportunity. Thank you, Michael. Great. That out of the way, if you know of any opportunities, please send us an email, and happy to add it to our monthly roundup, or just retweet it in our social media for more exposure. And if you're looking, also reach out. Without further ado, I'll pass on the floor to Michael. I just love that picture, man. I've been using that everywhere. So thank you, and please take it away. I'll just stop sharing.
Awesome, thanks, Miguel. Now we do have Orchestra face masks available if anyone's interested in it. It's been pretty pretty useful. So awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining me. This session is entitled Pragmatic Governance for Microsoft Teams. Oops, hang on. Let me go back to where I was. Perfect. Entitled Pragmatic Governance for Microsoft Teams. Really, this is a session that talks around governance in start off in some high level, but really get down to some of the knobs that you can turn and some of the options, specifically around governance capabilities within Teams. Obviously, governance is a really big topic, and we're going to cover a pretty broad range of things. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. If you have any questions at all, like I said, I'd love to make it a discussion. But the reason that I really like this presentation is I don't think people are aware, and just in terms of how many options you have in Teams to implement governance really easily and really quickly. And everything that I'm going to show you is all out of the box Microsoft 365 configuration. It all kind of lives in different places, unfortunately. That's just the way that that M365 is constructed, but there's definitely a lot that you can do. So I think I know most people on the call, but my name is Michael Bisarik. I'm the CEO and the founder here at Orchestry. We're a new product that just launched about 7 weeks ago. We are an adoption and a governance platform that sits on Microsoft 365. Where we fit in is providing additional adoption and governance capabilities, not just for Teams, but actually for multiple workloads. So we support Teams and SharePoint, Planner, soon to support Yammer and Microsoft Stream as well. I've been working with SharePoint since I came here to Vancouver in 2008. So lots of experience, and I used to have an intranet in a box company that was acquired a couple of years ago. So I had a bit of a break, and then we're back into it as well, trying to hopefully make another product and another solution that's going to be really impactful for people. So in terms of an agenda, we'll talk about some session goals, just to level set in terms of exactly what you might expect. We'll start off pretty high level in terms of what is governance in Teams and really Microsoft 365. We'll go down into a little bit more detail. And then the last half of this presentation is actually some examples. So we're going to go through in terms of how you can implement some of these governance policies and settings through the use cases of 3 different companies, because I think this works quite well. So one company is called Lockdown Corp, which wants everything locked down. One company is called Balanced Industries, who wants to have more of a balanced governance approach, so really balancing user needs and governance and IT. And the last one is Startup Inc. And Startup Inc. just wants everyone to be able to do anything. So they have a very limited governance model there. But hopefully showing you those 3 scenarios will help you understand some of the things that you can do in M365. So the goals: educate you on the out of the box that M365 provides, talk a little bit around governance and what it entails, social scenarios. And really what I like with these sessions is I want them to be tangible. So some tangible examples and some pragmatic examples that you can get back to your organization, start implementing. So let's start off with what exactly is governance in Microsoft Teams. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but from a strategic level, I think a lot of organizations have huge troubles just even getting a start in terms of what governance is. Really, in my mind, as I say, good governance should drive adoption, and the goal of governance, I think, should be giving your users a dynamic and a frictionless self-service experience, but also making sure that you have enough controls there from the IT side. In terms of a strategic level, typically governance is that process of defining, people, processes, rules, and structure. Of course, in all of M365, but we're going to concentrate in Microsoft Teams. A typical governance plan when we work with customers is things like defining roles, so the different types of roles and use cases. So whether it's IT, admin, Azure AD people, the responsibilities for each role. So for instance, what can team owners do? What can team members do? Defining some sort of process as well. So that process, not only in the creation and the usage, but also in the archival of Teams, access and ownership and policies for managing content. So things like taxonomy, labeling, content types, or all of those good things. So a lot typically goes into that. What we've found, though, is that a lot of companies, the output of this is a document, and it's typically a document that not many people read, and it's more of an esoteric exercise. What I want to show you today is how you can take some of these policies, which are a little bit esoteric, and actually implement them directly in M365. And in terms of governance, there's quite a lot of things that governance can help you achieve. So whether it's from that compliance perspective to make sure that you have, you make sure you abide to those rules of SOX or any legal rules. Another way that I like to think about governance as well is really to help drive adoption. So, providing capabilities to end users with appropriate controls in place. And what's really interesting in some of these, I guess, governance features within Teams, a lot of this controls things like the user experience, which can be really useful in driving adoption. So one of the really typical examples I give is, when I share my screen within Teams, I have a whole bunch of different options of what to share. And one of them is the Microsoft Whiteboard. But as a user, if I have no idea what the whiteboard is, it can be confusing. So what we find is a lot of organizations, through a governance switch in the Teams Admin Center, you can disable that whiteboard feature. And then what you can do is maybe do some training for your end users, introduce that capability to the organization, and then enable that feature for everyone. So it's a bit of a misnomer that you can't really control the UI of Teams or the capabilities that ship with Teams. You can, of course, it's not complete, but there's a lot of things that you can do, once again, either to add up and light up and remove features. And basically, probably the biggest thing I think that we're finding from a governance perspective is to help manage sprawl of content and teams in particular. So when we were starting Orchestra, it started off as a research project. So I spoke to about 80 different companies and partners, and everyone had an issue with sprawl with Teams. So that came in a number of different flavors. So one of them was people creating too many teams. One of them was people creating duplicate teams also, and really that became a huge issue. So the idea that governance can help you manage that sprawl by either having a bit more of a formalized process of requesting teams, or at least guiding users through that process of requests also. And I think the thing with governance is there's no real right place, right? So everyone is going to fit somewhere along this spectrum. When we spoke to the customers during our research project, and people kind of fit almost 50-50 on the far ends. So either they rolled out teams, they didn't have any governance in place, everyone could create anything, there was no naming conventions, there was no policies, there was really no guidance for users to do once Teams has been deployed. Of course, collaboration was super fast and agile, but it can be risky and it commonly leads to sprawl. The other way was organizations that came through more from the SharePoint on-prem world. And this was organizations who wanted to have everything very tightly controlled. So they would disable the ability for end users to create teams. Typically, they would have to go through some form of process, whether that be automated or whether that be actually speaking to a person. This tended to work for some, but it was a huge investment, whether they're doing custom code, or alternatively, in a lot of cases, you had to have a resource, like a human being there, speaking to someone, asking them, what do they want on their team, and kind of configure it for them. So every organization is going to fit somewhere along this curve. It's one of the reasons why governance can be complicated. There's no right answer, but just rest assured, there's enough capabilities within M365 or even third-party tools to make sure that you find the right place on this spectrum. And the last thing that we typically get is like, why bother? Why bother spending time with governance? Why don't we just light up Teams? And then, if there's stuff that's there, that's okay. Search will take care of it, or anything else. So the best example that I would give is that out of the box, the majority of those features and settings in Teams are enabled. Pretty much everything is enabled apart from guest access if you just deploy it as is. And that might not be right to your organization. But from an end user side, I think the most interesting approach is if you don't really understand what you're trying to do with Teams and you don't have any governance in place, because everything is enabled, it's the same thing as if you were going to roll out iPhones, let's say, to all of your employees, and you kind of, you don't really understand what they're trying to do with it. So what you're going to do is give them an iPhone, but you're going to download and install every single app that exists on the App Store and give it to them and expect them to use it, right? It doesn't really make much sense, but that's really the default options that you get with Microsoft 365. So the nice thing is, like I said, lots of simple configuration that you can do to enable and disable these features. Like I said, I think most organizations don't bother just because it's such a huge topic. And what we find is anything that you can automate from a governance perspective is much better than a manual process that you expect users to follow. So things like governance documents and so forth, no one really follows that unless it's automated or built into the process. It's going to be really difficult to have users enable. And with resources, there's a bunch of really good resources as well from Microsoft. So there's something called the Teams Adoption Hub. There's a whole bunch of other things as well, which were just released within Ignite 2020 also. But really, the Teams Adoption Hub, I think, is a really great way to at least get started, both from an adoption perspective and from a governance perspective also. So going down a layer, if we talk about kind of governance from that high level, how is this actually implemented within Teams and Microsoft 365? Like, what can we do to actually implement that? So the first thing really to note is when we talk about Teams governance, really it's more around group governance. Groups are this construct, so they're Microsoft 365 groups. They used to be called Office 365 groups. I'm sure in a couple of years or a year's time, it'll change name, but whatever. A group is really a membership service, and it's one of these things where every time I create a team is part of an underlying group. And what that group allows you to do is it allows you to have a number of different capabilities that you can share between that group. So you could have a group, and part of that group could be a team and a SharePoint site, maybe a planner plan, maybe a Power BI workspace. There could be a shared mailbox. But every time you create teams or even group connected team sites within SharePoint, you basically are creating one of these group constructs. And a lot of the governance features and the governance capabilities are based on the group itself. So especially things like expiry and also guest access, two really, really important things is based on groups. So the first tip that I would give you if you're trying to go down this Teams governance journey is really first to understand what groups are, how they work, and some of the group configuration options that you can apply governance to. If we go down a level, though, when we look at Teams itself, there's a number of different settings and policies that you can apply. And once again, where it gets a little bit funky is that some of these settings are applied in the Teams Admin Center. Some of the settings are more group related and applied to Azure AD or applied through Azure AD. And some of them are more security and compliance related, which is once again a completely different set of admin. But in general, there's two types of settings or governance settings that you can apply to Teams. One of them is called a setting, which is almost like a default thing that's applied to everyone. And then you can also apply policies, which can be applied to users, to individuals, or to groups of users. And it's really the policies that allow you to have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you configure Teams for your organization, and either how Teams is configured for different groups of users. And this can be really, really powerful. In terms of the governance controls for Teams, like there's a ton there, and it's surprising to me that this isn't talked about more, because there's a ton of stuff that you can do. Everything from things like application policies, so things like permission and setup policies also, which we'll talk about, policies around meetings, policies around live events, policies around messaging, which is both one-to-one messaging as well as posting within channels, obviously guest access and external access, what members and guests can use, and group classification. So there's a lot of controls there, which could really provide you with some great kind of use cases to implement governance through. And once again, the nice thing is this is all out of the box. There's no need for PowerShell. There's none of that. And you can go and change these settings. And if it doesn't work, you can change them back really, really quickly also. So it can be, pretty low risk, especially if you know what you're doing. Most of the time when we start off with governance, though, we start off with these 7 things, right? So the first one is around who can create things. So who can create SharePoint sites or Teams or libraries or Outlook? That's probably the biggest question that people have, and the biggest one is being able to control who can create Teams or SharePoint sites for Teams in particular. The next thing is around naming conventions. So making sure that your organization has some naming conventions, both around teams and groups. Guest access is another huge thing, especially if you have guest access enabled and you're working with guest users. So whether you have guest access enabled, who can add guests, what type of sharing is available also. And then we get to, some of the less commonly implemented things, but still super, super valuable. So things like expiries. So having the idea that, once users use Teams, maybe after a certain amount of time, they can expire, various types of policies, retention, e-discovery, DLP. And then a big thing that's coming through at the moment is the use of templates. And I think this is a governance question as well. So instead of getting your users to create blank teams and having your end users then, assuming your end users know how to add tabs and channels and configure teams, giving them a set of templates to start off with can be really useful. The templating capabilities that Microsoft provides for Teams and SharePoint in particular are pretty basic, but it will get you at least more of a step than just giving people a blank team and expecting them, like I said, to kind of work it out themselves. So that's kind of the options. Let's kind of see how we can apply these options to a couple of organizations. So the way that we are going to do this is pretty example based. So we got 3 different organizations, like I said, for 3 different governance needs. So these organizations kind of correspond to the very tightly locked down type of governance implementation for Lockdown Corp. So they work in a heavily regulated industry dealing with personal identifiable information and health. So Lockdown Corp, from a governance perspective, is always going to lean towards super restrictive settings. Balanced industries is probably where most organizations are. I mean, most organizations like to think that they're balanced, but a lot of them aren't. But balanced industries wants to kind of straddle that between the IT control and really driving user adoption. And then Startup Inc. is growing rapidly. What they want to do is they want to empower their users and drive productivity with as little friction as possible. So they're going to be very open in the types of things they're going to allow their users to do. And really Startup Inc. is that default set of options that you're going to get with Teams as well. By default, like I said, Teams is governed, and really M365 is much more Startup Inc. governance based, where it's open as opposed to Lockdown Corp. So let's talk about the first thing which we talked about, which is around Teams creation. So really the decision point from a governance perspective is who's going to be able to create groups and teams within your organization. By default, anyone can, right? So any user can go create a team or a SharePoint site, or even plan or anything like that, but you can also control that. Now, one of the reasons that you might want to control that is, once again, maybe you're having things like sprawl within your organization. People are maybe creating teams and groups and SharePoint sites without any training, so they have no idea what they basically are. Like I said, you can either turn this off completely and drive it through an alternative process. So a really common thing is that teams and groups and SharePoint creation is completely disabled, and then they have to go through a process like filling in a form, and someone from IT will be able to create that. But also you can do that in such a way that only a certain subset of users can create teams or SharePoint sites or groups. So a common example that we see in organizations is they might have everything disabled, and in order to create teams, maybe users have to go through a 1-hour training course to help them understand what the governance policies around teams creation is, what it is. Then they get added to a policy within the Teams admin center, where they can go and actually create these things also. Yeah, go ahead.
How often do you see this type of control already applied and organizations taking that like proactive approach to lock it down?
So we find what we've been finding, I mean, I wonder what you think as well. What we've been finding is a lot of organizations deployed Teams when COVID hit, and they just said, okay, let's create anything. And then now, 3 or 6 months, they're like, oh my God, we've got a huge mess, so let's lock everything down. I don't think they're doing it because of planning. I think they're just doing it because they're like, oh my God, like what is happening? So one company we spoke to like a few weeks ago, I mean, there are about 10,000 people. They launched Teams when COVID hit in like the start of March. They've got 5,000 teams. They use probably 100 of those 5,000 teams. And because they had no governance, just people didn't know what they were doing. So they had a bunch of crazy stuff. So the best team name I've ever heard was someone created a team called Do Not Invite John Here. Like that's the name of the team, right? Because people didn't know, right? And because anyone can go and create anything. So I would like to think that people do this and plan it, but I think it's much more reactive, unfortunately.
Given the amount of settings that we have available in Azure AD and Teams, it's just mind-blowing how this one is the barrier of entry of having to use PowerShell to restrict that. It was unfortunate at the time. I'm sure Microsoft will get to a point where this is like a flick of a switch. But an unintended consequence of that was that sprawl of teams with names that don't make any sense, or use cases that are like nowhere near what the right intent should be. Right?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I think intentionally Microsoft makes this as difficult as possible. So honestly, because it's not in Microsoft interest not to have people's content within Office 365, right? It really is. I think what they want to do is, the more content we have in there, the better it's going to be, probably for the organization, but it's definitely better from Microsoft's side, right? Because that content is in the cloud. So I don't know. I don't think there's going to be a simple switch, to be honest with you. I think they make it intentionally difficult. And if you've ever done this before, it's like a 10-step process. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense.
But not everyone has that IT knowledge of, but what is PowerShell, right? For some people.
Exactly. Yeah, or even getting access to that as well. Yeah.
But
it is possible, right? So applying that to Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp, they just disable everything. So nothing's going to be able to be created. No one can create teams. And what they need to do is they use a tool for requests. So this is if it's very, very tightly restricted. Balanced Industries is somewhere in the middle. So this is an interesting approach, actually quite like. This idea that teams or creation of teams, let's concentrate on teams, is locked down for everyone. But if you want the ability to create teams, you go through like a 2-hour training session, and then they can move you into an Active Directory group, which allows you to create a team. So you get a nice little balance there. And I think, Miguel, like you were saying, at least users have some sort of training. So maybe they go through how to name a team and what the metadata is, what channels are. That can really, really help. And then Startup Inc., well, they're a startup, so they're just like, yep, let's just go at it. So Startup Inc. lets anyone create anything. And if they have issues later on, they'll kind of deal with it then. And Startup Inc. is the kind of the default option there. But once again, this can be controlled. It's a little bit difficult, but there is the possibility there to do that. Another one which it is much easier to control is this concept of default and available apps. So the idea is that can we, or what apps do we want to give to our users access to, and to be able to default for our users? So there's really two parts to this. One of them is what apps do we want to make available on that left-hand Teams rail for people? And one of the nice things around Teams is you can actually pre-pin apps for users so they don't have to go find them. And what's more interesting is because you can do this at a group or a user basis, you can actually split this up. So a really good example is maybe you have your marketing people and one of their default apps is the Adobe Creative Cloud on the left-hand side. So if someone from marketing logs into Teams, they have that app ready to rock and roll for them. Whereas if it's someone from IT, maybe it's Azure DevOps or something that's more IT focused. I think that's a really great way from an adoption perspective. It's also a really good way that if you're going to bring your intranet into Teams also, or any sort of third-party system that you've developed, and you don't want users to have to go through the process of going through the Teams App Store and adding it, you can pin these items to here. I think that's really, really useful. The other thing around this control is also controlling which apps people can add. So through the Teams App Store, if you ever go in there, there's like 800 different apps, I think now, like there's a lot of them. And by default, anyone can add any third-party app, right? So users, if you have that default setting, can go and add anything. That might not necessarily be what you want to do. So you can control this. And it's done through the Teams Admin Center. There's 3 things that you have to use: an organizational wide setting, an app permission policy, and an app setup policy. But let's talk about how we can apply that. So Lockdown Corp, basically, they're going to remove access to any third-party apps. They don't want people to use any third-party apps from anywhere. They're not going to allow users to add any personal apps or to pin apps. So Lockdown Corp is basically saying, how you get Teams with the activity chat, the calendar and recording, that's it. There's no more third-party apps, and you're not going to be able to do anything. So in that case, what they do, they set up an organizational wide setting to turn off all of those things. They create what's called an application permission policy. And what this allows you to do is to block all of the Microsoft apps, all of the third-party apps, and all of the custom apps. And then they also do an app setup policy. So I know it's 3 different configuration options, but they all kind of combine together, where they disallow user pinning. So users can't pin other apps to that left-hand rail. So this is kind of that extreme, right? That they're really locking down what users can do with Teams. Balanced industries is a little bit different. So they're good with people, pinning their own apps. They want to allow people to add some third-party pieces that want to allow users to use some third-party apps, but not all of them. So they're just going to basically allow specific apps, and they have a third-party governance tool which they want to use, and they want to pin that for everyone and make it available. So the same thing with these settings applied in a slightly different way. They're going to have an organizational-wide setting, which is going to allow third-party apps. They have an application permission policy, so they're going to allow all of the Microsoft Teams apps. So that means users can add tabs like OneNote and Planner and SharePoint and all of those things. With the third-party apps, they're going to block all of the other ones, but they're going to allow the 3 that they've vetted and they use in their organization. So the Adobe Creative Cloud, Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow. And then what they're doing is they're allowing a custom app that they've developed, and they're using an application setup policy to pin that app for everyone also. So this is one of the ways that you can actually pre-can apps for everyone. So this is a nice balanced approach. We hardly see this being done. Usually it's an all or nothing thing, but I think it's kind of useful to be able to do that. And then the last one is is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. is basically the default option. And this is users can go and add anything from anywhere and do whatever they want. And this is actually the default option. So in this case, users can add custom apps, they can add third-party apps, they can choose any apps from the Team App Store, as well as any custom apps that have been developed. And in terms of the rail, they can even upload custom apps and allow user pinning through here. So once again, this is the most open model, but it's also pretty much the default that you would get if you roll out Teams.
I've mostly faced the all or nothing.
Yeah.
And for the balance one, do you know if you have the three that you have available and the custom app, are those the only ones that show, or does it show the whole array, but you can only install a few?
No, I think it used to be that it used to show all of them, but now I think it actually filters down. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it actually filters down through it. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a while since I've done that too, so I'll need to take a look.
Perfect. So let's talk about Teams naming. So this is the other thing, which is obviously pretty important. So this idea of applying naming policies to groups. So the decision point around this is to enforce conventions around teams groups are going to be named. Really, the reason for this is naming can have a huge impact of findability. If people can create teams with any sorts of names, it can be really, really problematic. There is some capabilities within M365 to do things like group naming policies as well as blocked words. Unfortunately, it's part of the Azure AD P1 license, so it can be an additional license on top of E3, or some organizations may have it and some might. The other problem is there's no real way to stop team owners from changing a name as well once a team or SharePoint site is created, unless you use a third-party tool. I'm a real big fan of naming policies just because it can, it's one of the only ways within Teams that you can provide some sort of structure. So this idea that, for different types of teams, you might have a different naming convention. So maybe for project teams and sites, you might prepend PRJ dash with a project ID, dash with the descriptive name. You might do the same thing for departments. If you've got guests or external users available within a team, you might want to note that down also. But really the idea is that having these naming conventions or these naming policies, what that allows you to do is, as a user, I could really quickly ascertain what exactly or what that team is for. And that's really useful, particularly if you've got tens or hundreds of teams in particular. So on the left-hand side, we can see a list of teams which are just called without any naming conventions, whereas on the right-hand side, we've actually given them naming conventions here. And it's kind of nice because I can see which are department-focused teams, which are project-focused teams, and maybe which are like multinational teams as well. So it does require a little bit of training. From a governance perspective, There's no real way to do this out of the box. You're looking at a third-party tool, but once again, this can be super, super handy, particularly if you have the ability to not only apply a naming convention, but maybe apply metadata as well to these particular groups. Once again, third-party tools can do that, but you can't do that out of the box. But at least having some naming conventions can be really, really useful. Next thing is around team owner and team member settings. So being able to control what members are able to do within teams. Well, so once again, the decision point from a governance perspective is how much power do you want your members to have in teams to be able to do things like adding channels, adding and removing tabs, and editing messages. So some organizations, they really want to limit what members can do because they go down the process of essentially the team owner is going to be responsible for the structure of the team, whereas the team members are really there just to put in content. Now, by default, as a team member, I can change the structure of that team. I can add new tabs, I can add new channels, I can add connectors, for instance. You might not necessarily want to do that. Maybe you want your team owners to have, a higher level of permission, so only team owners can perform those things. So once again, you can control that. Now, this is done on the individual team level itself. It's located under member permissions for each setting. But there's actually quite a lot of flexibility here that you can do. So how can we apply this to our 3 organizations? The first one is Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp, as you know, just locks everything down, right? So for members, essentially members can't add channels, they can't add tabs, they can't add apps, they can't add connectors. They're not even allowed to delete or edit their messages. Now, we've worked with some organizations like this, which are super highly regulated, that essentially everything is a record. But if you set up teams in this way for your members, the only thing members can really do is post and add documents. They can't change the actual structure of that underlying team. It might work for you or it might not, but it is an option. In the balanced industries, so balanced industries is a little bit more open. So they want to allow anyone to become a team member without training, but they only want site owners to create the structure of that team. So they want site owners to be responsible for the tabs and the channels and the channels within that team. They're going to allow members to add tabs. They're going to allow them to add connectors, but they're not going to allow them to basically do much more. So this gives kind of an interesting approach. Once again, it gives team owners control of their team, but members can collaborate effectively. They can't create and update channels, but they can add things like tabs and connectors, and of course they can edit their messages. So a little bit more open than Lockdown Corp. And then Startup Inc. is going to allow people to do anything, right? So in this case, what's going to happen? Anything that they can do, they can. And this is, like I said, this is the default option that you'll find within Teams itself, where members can go and do anything. Once again, this can be good. It can also be a bit of a hindrance, especially if you don't have any training for your members as well. So the final one that we'll talk about is around Teams meeting sessions, because meetings is obviously pretty hot. Now there's a bunch of configuration options around Teams meetings. We're just going to talk about a couple today relating to content sharing and guests. So 2 things, and the decision point around this is how will users be able to share content during a Teams meeting, and then what should guests be allowed to do during a Teams meeting. Now, the reason that this comes up is we worked with a customer and they constantly had data loss when they were inviting guest users to meetings, because what people typically did was they were sharing their screen, right? And as they tabbed across different applications, maybe for a split second, an Excel spreadsheet came out, or more commonly an email, their Outlook was open, so that kind of flashed up on the screen and their guests could see that as well. So they didn't want to do that. The other thing as well is, what should guests be able to do? Like, do you want to allow guests to share content? Do you want to allow guests to be able to take control of people's screens? Like, all of these options are actually available for you for meetings. So let's see how we can apply these to our three organizations. So Lockdown Corp, obviously, they're going to lock everything down. They're not allowing anonymous users to join a meeting, so that's the first thing. They're also disallowing guests to basically start meetings. They're disallowing guests to have private conversations. They're disallowing guests to chat in meetings also. And from a content sharing perspective, the only thing that people are allowed to share is a PowerPoint presentation. A lot of people don't know that this actually setting exists, but you can actually limit the content sharing options that people can't share their screen. Participants can't give or request control of other people's screens, and you can't do that to external people only. So in this case, the only thing that a person in Lockdown Corp, if they're in a Teams meeting, would see when they click on share is to share a PowerPoint presentation. That's it. Now, of course, that might not be necessarily very useful for everyone, but once again, this is an option of a very kind of extreme lockdown approach. Balanced industry is a little bit different. So what balanced industries allow them to do is they allowed sharing, but only for a single application. They're going to allow participants in the organization to take control of other people's screens, but they're not going to allow external users. And they can't share their screen. They can share a single application, so that will hopefully stop some data leak. They're going to allow PowerPoint sharing and whiteboard sharing, and they're going to allow shared notes only. For the guest perspective, they basically got a few things turned off, but they're allowing Meet now in private meetings also, and they're allowing chat in those meetings as well. So once again, a bit of a balance there. And then finally, for Startup Inc., this is once again the default set of options, so people can share anything, including their entire screen. Participants can give or request control. Guests can give or request control, and from a guest perspective, they're going to allow anonymous people to start a meeting or so and automatically admit everyone. So this is probably not the best approach that an anonymous person can start a meeting, but it is an option there. And once again, they're enabling things like captions and allow chatting meetings. So even just those two small things, and like I said, with this meeting policy, this content sharing thing is like one of probably 10 things on there. There's a ton of options here. Once again, you can see some of the level of granularity that you can get into also. Some other common questions which we find from that governance perspective, can I control if guests have access to my teams? You can, of course, through that guest access configuration. Unfortunately, in out-of-the-box M365, either every team has guest access enabled or no teams have guest access enabled. If you want to do that on a team-by-team basis, you're looking at a third-party tool like Orchestrate, or you're looking at PowerShell. Can you control, or can I allow only certain users the ability to create private channels? You can do this on a per user by per user basis. Once again, this is a nice way to link training into the capabilities of teams. So maybe you can't create private channels unless you've been through training course or some sort of quick training, and then we can move you in there so you can. The other big one as well is, can you remove the external storage options within files? This is more of a UX tweak, but if you go to files, you know how you can click on add external storage, and you have like Box and Ignite and Google Drive. If you don't use that, just remove that, right? There's no point cluttering up the UI with more stuff that people will never use. Can I stop users from using the urgent notification feature? You can do that as well. Once again, clearing up the interface. And can I remove the chat function if I'm using Skype or Slack? You actually can. You can remove that entire chat feature of Teams. If, like I said, you're using an external tool, or maybe you're still using Skype for chat, so you want to drive people to that also. So just some takeaways. I know we're going a little bit over time, but just some takeaways. Like I said, the idea with governance is really to, empower and control your organization. It's really to help users through that process. As you can see, Teams provides a ton of governance options. We've probably covered 1/100th of what you can actually do there, but like you said, there's a lot there. And what I would say is kind of like Miguel was kind of alluding to. Don't just roll out Teams without doing any of this work, right? There's a lot of really quick, simple value things that you can do to control Teams and to put a little bit of governance in place to make that really useful for your organization. Because like I said, by default, everything is basically enabled. So thanks all for your time. If you want to get in touch with me, my details are below, and you can also follow me on Twitter as well.
Perfect. Anyone has any questions for Michael?
I have
Dino.
a question. This is more at a user level. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on having a chat window and also having the channel chat window, because I've tried different chat options, and I find that the chat is a lot better than using a channel to have any conversations. Is there like is there like a preferred way to have the group discussions? Is it just through the chat versus having a chat in a channel?
Yeah, I mean, I think really the idea of chat should be used, I think, more for one-to-one chatting. I think if there's conversations that involve a number of different people, I think having them in that channel really encourages transparency through. I think people are just used to chatting like they used to do in Skype or in Slack, for instance. But definitely we try to get people to actually have the majority of their conversations within Teams channels. Now, I know that can be a bit problematic because the notifications go crazy and it's a little bit of different experience. But I think that's better than having one-to-one chats than that, because then really from a transparency perspective and from an information sharing perspective, if you're having a conversation but you're not part of that conversation as a user, you never see it. At least if it's in a channel, you expose that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely for projects, really recommend it. Having that centralized, new people joining the project have a good idea of what has happened, right? They have those threads. People who have maybe another insight of a conversation that's ongoing can chime in, right? So those are great benefits that really help and empower the team to accomplish more.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries. Okay, any other questions from the audience? If not, before we go, you mind switching to together mode? I'm gonna make a quick. There you go. Any other folks who want to maybe share their screen? There you go, for the group picture of the event. Perfect. Okay, so
That actually works surprisingly well. I've been watching the NBA finals with this together mode thing going on, so I like it.
That's pretty good. Guys, well, I really appreciate your time. Michael, thank you so much. I think we had amazing insights and overall how you framed it from the spectrum of lockdown, where financial, we don't share, we don't do much sharing here, to like we're just trying to get by, right? And for some organizations, this will be very refreshing to see what those key decision points are and how they should be applying them. So really appreciate it that you touched on those. I wish we had 3 more hours to get into like external access and guests and who can invite people and all that good stuff, but we'll probably leave that one for a future.
Awesome. No, thanks for having me.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I also have let's see. I don't think I have much more on my deck. Next month's presentation, I don't have a speaker yet. I'm working on it. But a great advantage of moving to virtual is that I can get people from anywhere in the world. So that's a great advantage. I'll make sure we get more people for November. December, we usually do a recap, so we'll see how that might play. And stay safe, guys. Hopefully, at some point we'll return to our in-person events. For now, I'm just so happy that we had the opportunity to connect. Our meeting will be recorded and posted on YouTube. So if you know of other people who might benefit from today's content, please check out our Twitter account for that announcement and subscribe to the channel. I feel like a social media person now with all this scribing and stuff. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks all.
Thanks, guys. Take care.